Players don't want to do a session 0. Hi, could someone please help? I'm a new DM with new players, and none of them seem to want to put any kind of commitment into it, like whatsoever. None of the players are even able to do a session 0. They don't even seem to want to do a half an hour phone call to organize their characters. They just want it to be super simple, no commitment from them. I have made it clear to them that this would be the only out-of-game commitment they would need to make, and they are just super against it for some reason. Do I keep on pushing it? Do I give up and find new players? I'm very aware of not breaking bridges. I think they mean burning bridges. So I've tried to be as flexible as possible. Yet still they seem to cling on to their preconceptions. Help! Over the years, I've found that the discussion around Session 0 has just been getting more and more passionate. It helps make sure that everybody is on the same page in setting expectations of the story and setting. And most importantly, a lot of people have found that it can prevent a lot of unnecessary out-of-game conflict. With this situation though, what really stuck out to me is that not only is this a new DM, it's with new players, and it's the players that seem resistant to wanting to even have a Session 0 in the first place. And as I was thinking more and more about it, I really thought there's a lot to unpack with this situation. Hi, I'm John. This is Dragon Mind, where we discover our best selves through gaming, and today we are discussing the function of Session 0s. Let's get into it. So as usual, let's start by discussing the term Session 0 so we can all get on the same page. A Session 0 for a Session 0, if you will. So really, a Session 0 is just that. It's where the players and the game master sit down to discuss things before starting a TTRPG. It's common for a Session 0 to have all of the players create their characters, have the game master discuss the game's tone and maybe the game's setting, and to establish content boundaries so nothing weird comes up in the storytelling. For example, if a GM is about to run a game of D&D, one player may be expecting a narratively dense, character-driven story, kind of like what they've seen on Critical Role, while another player may be wanting to play a more simulationist dungeon crawl, where they're describing how their character meticulously searches each room to prevent traps or things from popping out at them. I've definitely been at that table where two players want something very different out of the experience, and they got on each other's nerves because one just wanted to push the story and the emotional thread forward, while the other wanted to make sure that their character wouldn't be killed out of the blue, so they wanted to make sure that there was no trap about to be sprung on them, if at all possible. And especially in a situation like that, it is a lot easier to kind of nip it in the bud ahead of time with a Session 0 than to have the conflict emerge mid-game and then trying to hash it out when it feels a little too late. And oftentimes, when I come across testimonials about table disputes, that is the sense I get from a lot of commenters. A lot of it amounts to, well, if you had had a Session 0, this wouldn't have happened. Which I think segues me as nicely as it can into my series of hot takes about Session 0s. So please, keep my comment section civil, folks. First, I do agree with a lot of those comments. I think when you have a Session 0 and everyone is able to get on the same page and agree to the kind of game they want, I think a lot of times that can prevent a lot of unnecessary tension. And a trend I don't like is somehow thinking that Session 0s are this magic solution that will prevent any out-of-game conflict coming up at your table. Session 0s are a tool that can help, but I don't think they are a substitute for learning real-time conflict resolution skills, which, like it or not, is kind of part of being a game master. Part of what I love about TTRPGs is that they're ultimately very human games. The rules and systems ultimately end up kind of like guidelines, more so than hard and strict procedures, and so even though Session 0s can prevent a lot of things that come up at the table, you kind of have to go in knowing that there are going to be some things that you didn't see coming, and to be okay with the mistakes you're going to make, learning from them as best you can to keep the game as entertaining and enjoyable as possible. Which actually brings me to my second hot take. The benefits of Session 0s are invaluable, but a Session 0 itself as the method may or may not be necessary based on your group. Now, another YouTube channel, Mystic Arts, posted about a year ago this clickbaity thumbnail video about how he doesn't run session zeros, in the sense of there isn't one gathering where everyone sits down at a table to discuss these things. Instead, he talked about opening up a group text message, which the benefit to that is that everything is going to be documented. So now if there is a disagreement on what the expectations were, you can at least point back to it to be like, well, this is where I said this. Or you may go through your text messages and go, ooh, that was a part I forgot and I left out. For me in particular, whenever I run, especially a longer game, I like creating what I call a reference doc, a Google Doc all the players have access to at all times, to be able to look at all of our homebrew rules or custom magic items, but also look at what the expectations are. So if there's a player that's kind of going off the rails or doing something that just isn't the vibe of the game we're running, it gives me something solid I can point back to be like, this was the agreement that we all made. Is this still relevant for you? And are you going to have fun playing this game we all want to? And ultimately, I've run all kinds of session zeros. I've run the ones where we all sit down at the table and create characters together. I've done them as a Zoom call or just a group text thread. It kind of depends on the players I'm playing with, their level of comfort with whatever system we're playing, and how much I feel we really need to sit down to get on the same page. Once you've run 2 or 3 campaigns with the same group of players, there is a tipping point where I don't feel like we all need to sit down and create our characters together. We may want to discuss our character concepts to make sure that everyone's character has a chance to shine, but the actual nuts and bolts of applying modifiers or picking up skill proficiencies or whatever, I don't think we necessarily need to sit down and do that. And if you play with the same players for a while, you can have one sense of each other's boundaries, and unless something changes, you don't need to sit down every time to be like, all right, this is something we're not going to talk about. Which I think probably brings me to my hottest take of this situation, which is, I don't know if a session zero is completely necessary for this particular player group. Hear me out here. To be clear, I don't know these players, I don't know this DM. I'm reading into this situation at face value and presenting a possible version of everyone's perspective informed by my own experiences. There could totally be more context that would invalidate the points that I'm trying to make, but I still think these points are worth discussing, because if it's happened to me and it's happened to other people I know, possibly it could apply to you or a situation like the OP here. The first thing I keyed in on is, this is a new DM with new players. Now, I am making an assumption here. I'm guessing that this new DM is excited to run a TTRPG. And as many of us excited people do, they're probably researching, watching a lot of videos, or listening to podcasts about DMing advice. And, as is natural, I'm sure they're hearing over and over again, you need a session zero, you need a session zero. In fact, reading some comments on their own thread, there was this implication that if you're not going to run a session zero, you might as well just not play the game. That's how important a lot of DMs think it is. But let me ask you this, and this is an honest question, and I would love an honest answer. Do you hold a session zero every time you run a one-shot? I know I don't, and I know a lot of my favorite games have tended to be one-shots. And again, as I was reading through the comments on this post, one that really stuck out to me basically was summed up as D&D isn't some kind of board game you can take out, play once, and then put away. To which my immediate response was, why not? One assumption I love challenging is that TTRPGs have to be this long-running narrative game. And based on how the post is written, my guess is that's what OP is imagining from the game they want to run. And to be clear, that also doesn't mean I think there's anything wrong with running a game like that. And a vulnerability that I've just seen time and time again is that the longer a campaign runs, the more likely it is to fizzle before reaching a satisfying conclusion. The reason I'm kind of glomming onto this is the players have made it clear they want a simpler game. And them not committing doesn't necessarily mean that they can't play D&D. It just means they're not going to be running this years-long, full-running campaign. And the other sense I'm getting is that the OP and a lot of the commenters don't even seem to think that this is possible. Of course, these are probably the same personalities that roll their eyes at something like Peril and Pinebrook. But again, we know that OP is a new DM, which my recommendation for new DMs is to start with one-shots. Even at my current experience level, given what I know about these players, what I would probably do is set up a super simple quest. Maybe protect the caravan from goblins, rescue the blacksmith's daughter from the cave. Something incredibly generic. If the players don't even want to have a session 0, I don't know if they actually would even want to create their own characters. It might be easier just to pass out level 1 pre-made characters for them. I've definitely done that many times teaching new players the game. I don't see a lack of commitment as a disqualification for even trying the game out. I see it as an opportunity to teach. Even if a longer game doesn't ultimately excite them even after they've tried it, as a new DM, I don't see running a game like this as wasting my time. After all, any experience is going to be valuable experience, even if you end up making a lot of mistakes, or it's not as deep as a game you would want to run. Because you're a beginner, you need some kind of experience to get you going. In fact, running a simpler one-shot, in my experience, ends up being a lot better for newer DMs because they're not putting as much pressure on themselves. I found that new DMs that want to jump in with like a full campaign end up putting so much pressure on themselves, they often crack under it and end up not really liking the DMing role, versus ones that start small, build their skill set, and eventually work up to those longer running games. Now, that being said, if the original poster is super excited to just jump into a long running campaign, it's totally fair for them to break it to these players that it's probably not going to be a good fit. This post even has an update that says that's what they did, and honestly, more power to them. And I personally know a few DMs that if they're not running some long running game, then it's not even worth their time to DM. And you know what? They're not really DMing very often, because the number of people that have that much time on their hand is a lot fewer than the amount of people that may be able to jump into a one-shot here or there. So I guess ultimately you have to ask yourself, is it worth it to you in order to play a TTRPG to be willing to format it as one-shots or more episodic games, or do you really need to only be running a long-running campaign, even if it means that you don't get to play at all? But anyway, now I want to hear what you have to say. What's your read on this situation? Is the lack of a session 0 where everyone sits down enough for you to bow out of a game? And what do you think is the most helpful way for new DMs to get started? Let me know in the comments down below. In the description are links to the playtest for the TTRPG I'm developing called Swiftguard, a 5e adjacent system with a smoother action economy, intuitive spellcasting, and deep character customization. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the system, either in the comments of this video or in the Swiftguard community Discord, also linked in the description. Have an awesome day, and remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.